Everyone, and welcome. My name is Melanie Montero, and I am the project coordinator for St. Elizabeth Haven for Elder Justice. And I am also one of the staff members for the Rhode Island Coalition for Elder Justice.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Cheryl Patnord. I am a retired social worker, advocate, having worked in the field of interpersonal violence for 44 years. I am also involved in the Rhode Island Coalition and do a significant amount of training through the coalition.
Thank you for coming on and joining our series. The Rhode Island Coalition for Elder Justice wanted to create a webinar series about elder abuse and all the topics that regard elder abuse and centered from it and the different topics. So thank you for joining us. This right here is just a bit of a end abuse and later life overview. And Cheryl's just going to give us a few things we're going to talk about a little bit during the series today.
So today we'll be talking about what elder abuse is and hopefully demystifying elder abuse and some of the preconceived notions that folks have about elder abuse. So we'll be talking about what is elder abuse. We'll be talking about signs and symptoms. We'll be talking about resources, and we'll be also talking about the dynamics that go into victimization.
All right, everybody. And on that note, let's get started.
So the first topic we want to talk about is what is elder abuse? And what we know is that there are many misconceptions in our culture, in society, about elder abuse. There's also a significant amount of denial that elder abuse even occurs. So elder abuse is the mistreatment of older adults. It is always an act of power and control by the perpetrator over the victim. It is never the victim's fault, so we have to be extremely careful never to blame victims. The accountability is on the offender. So when we talk about elder abuse, we talk about, in no particular order, 5 types of abuse. The first is physical, which is the use of force causing pain or injury, inappropriate use of medications or physical restraints. And sometimes with medications, those can be used as a restraint. So sometimes medications, for example, a side effect might be that the person is drowsy, sleepy all the time. And sometimes offenders use medication as a way to keep the victim medicated or over-medicated. So it can be a type of restraint. The next is sexual abuse. And what we know is that for older adults, this is a very difficult area or difficult type of abuse to talk about, primarily because of the way they were raised. And it was, basically like a taboo subject. You didn't talk about those kinds of things. So sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact. And as I said, it's very difficult for older adults and really for any victim of sexual assault to report it and to talk about what really are very intimate details of one's abuse. Sexual abuse can also occur under the guise of normal caretaking. So, for example, when someone is being dressed or assisted with their dressing by a caretaker, there could be inappropriate touching that appears to be accidental. There's also bathing, or sometimes with medical care. If someone's clothes need to be changed, often under the guise of caretaking, again, sexual abuse can occur. The next is psychological abuse, which is mistreatment that affects one's emotional and or mental health. And that includes things like intimidation, threats, bullying, harassment, humiliation, isolation, and belittlement. And so what happens here is that the more someone is psychologically abused, the more they believe what's being told. So if someone tells me that I'm dumb, I'm fat, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, I'll never amount to anything, no one's ever going to believe me, eventually over time, I get worn down and I start to believe what's being told of me. And of course, a victim's biggest fear is that if they talk about the abuse, no one will believe them. So if you have someone reinforcing that to you, go ahead, tell. Nobody's going to believe you anyway because you're old, because you're forgetful. Then that just reinforces typically what victims think. And we want to pay attention to that. We want to make sure that we always believe victims. The next is intentional neglect, which is really deprivation of basic human needs. So, deprivation of food, clothing, it could be shelter or housing, medication, or good personal hygiene. And this is separate from self neglect. So, self neglect is when I, as an adult, make a decision to not do something that maybe someone else thinks is my best interest. So if I have diabetes and my primary care physician prescribes insulin, but I choose to eat M&Ms all day, and therefore my sugar goes through the roof, that's something that I'm choosing as a competent adult. That's self-neglect. No one is doing that to me. I'm making a choice. Uh, when we talk about intentional neglect, that's when someone, a caregiver or family member, intentionally neglects the basic human needs of that person. So intentionally deprives them of food or appropriate clothing, weather appropriate clothing, appropriate housing, that type of thing. And then the next is financial exploitation, which includes the misuse of money, property, or resources. And included in this are scams. And we know that certainly in Rhode Island and certainly within the country, scams are at an epidemic proportion. And what we know about scams is that once you're scammed, the bottom line is that you're not going to get your money back. And so educating people about scams is just as important as is educating people about their money being misused or they're being taken advantage of in terms of their property, someone moving in without really their permission. Um, and so for older adults and any victim of abuse, typically abuse happens to a victim in more than one way. So we call that co-occurring abuse. So I may be financially exploited and I may be physically abused. Very, very, very seldom do we see one type of abuse. So co-occurring abuse means that I'm experiencing more than one type of abuse or multiple forms of abuse.
Okay, so we also want to talk about some of the signs of elder abuse, right? So what are the signs? What are we seeing, and how can we observe them to find out what's going on, right? So we have unexplained injuries, bruises, or burns. And a lot of times the story they're telling you doesn't really match the description of what's happening, right? So say you're a caseworker, you've done a house visit, or even you're a friend or a neighbor and you live in an apartment complex, so you know the layout of the house, right? You know that maybe their bed's actually really low to the ground and there's actually carpet. So when they're saying that, oh, well, this bruise right here, I rolled off my bed and I got hurt. But knowing what you know, it's like, well, I don't think you necessarily get that much of a bruise from a low fall to a carpet, right? So paying attention to what they're telling you and see if the story matches with what you're seeing, correct? Sometimes it might be excessive fears, withdrawal, agitation. Say I'm visiting a client and, who I suspect might be the abuser walks in and they do a little jump, right? They're fidgety, right? They're not, you can tell you're observing and you're seeing these things and you want to look for that, right? That's what you want to observe. And then all of a sudden, the sudden inability to pay food, to pay bills, or personal items. Maybe you're popping in a friend's house and well, I don't really see any foods in the cabinet. And that's odd because usually so and so brings them food shopping beginning of the month when they get their SNAP benefits, right? It's beginning of the month, but there's still no food in the cabinets. So we're starting to see that. You know, Cheryl has stories. She's been in a home where all of a sudden the lights just went out. Thought it was it's a technicality, went in, well, it got shut off for no payment. So we need to look at that as well. Change in appetite, so unusual weight gain or loss, but there's no medical background for it, right? We all know that sometimes taking new prescriptions or new procedures, you might, have get the weight loss or weight gain, but it doesn't have to do medically, right? We're looking at it in terms of, are they being neglected? Are they getting the food? Or I learned very easily when I'm stressed out or in stressful situations, I eat. So for me, you might see the weight gain. But once again, it's knowing what the person is before and trying to see what's going on. Do they know their personal finances? Do they know how much maybe their social security check is? How much they get a month? Do they know how much their bills are? A lot of people would say, do they know how much the rent is a month? Do they know on average how much their electric bill is? Are they aware of that personal finance aspect of it? Unexplained changes in health and personal hygiene, you know, how are their clothes? Are they clean? Are they maybe, they've always been kept up and hair done? And, maybe it's a woman, she always had her full face of makeup on, do we seeing that? Are we the clothes they're wearing, are they weather appropriate, right? Right now it's getting to be fall. Are they having the nice pants to keep them warm when it gets breezy out? Are they wearing appropriate shoes? You have to look at that as well. And then dependency of an adult child or a caregiver for income and shelter, right? All of a sudden, why did they have to move in with their older adults, their older adult child, excuse me? Did they not have money to know? Did they lose their money, right? So we have to look at that. And then unauthorized withdrawal of funds or use of credit cards. Do they have access to their bank records, right? Are they seeing that, 100 here, 100 there is seemingly going out the window, or they can't explain where the $100 is going? You know, yes, they have a credit card that they've always had, but it was strictly for emergencies. Well, maybe someone went to the mall and had a couple of purchases and that they don't go to the mall. So we have to look at that and, are they seeing what's happening on their own credit card?
And one of the additional challenges that we see is that many people have joint accounts at
Mm-hmm.
banks or financial institutions. And oftentimes people don't understand that, for example, if Mel and
Mm-hmm.
I have a joint checking account or a joint savings account, Mel can leave here today and take all of the money that's in that account legally
Yep.
because it's a joint account, it's joint ownership, and there's nothing I can do about that. And so we like to think that if we have a joint account, we can trust the person whose name is also on the account. But oftentimes that's where we see financial exploitation
Mhm.
happen.
Yes. So elder abuse is now what's being called the silent epidemic, right? And we see at a national statistic, they say that only one abuse in every 10 is reported, right? Just reported. So we have a statistic from 2021, the Adult Protective Service here on Island, they investigated a little over 1,400 reports, elder abuse reports, right? So now if we apply that national statistics, that means that over 14,000 cases of abuse happened, but only that 10% was actually reported. And why we do this work and why we're presenting today is to bring light to this. It is a heavy subject, it is tough to talk about, but we need to bring light because we want these cases to get reported. That's what we want. So there's many reasons why elders don't report, right? And a few of them being fear of losing their home. No one wants to lose their home. What if it was the home they were born into? Is their family home? You don't want to lose that. Your goal is to age gracefully in that home and stay there, right? You don't want to lose it. And let's be honest, everyone's fear is going into a nursing home. We're not saying that there's not great nursing homes out there, but everyone wants to stay home with their belongings, with their pets, right? Who wants to leave their pet behind? They don't want to do that. Fear of losing their caregiver, right? If we talk about going into nursing home, it's a little bit like the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, right? Yes, they're your caregiver, but if they're being abusive towards you, do you really still want to lose that? Do you really want to call the cops and 911 on your adult child, the person that you've loved and cared for? That's not always something that wants to happen. Fear of retaliation, right? If you call, it will get 10 times worse, right? How many times of when a people of abuse have reported out. It's like, I was so scared. The threatening that would happen. And say if I did or I had a plan and they found out, the abuse escalated, right? And no one wants to the escalation. Cultural values, right? And we see a lot of times, especially in different cultures, sometimes we see patriarchal cultures, not saying necessarily all abusive, but for some people, their whole life, especially when it comes to finances and the home and what's going to happen, their fathers, you know, took that care of that. And then when they got married, the husband took over the finances. And then maybe the husband passed. So now the oldest adult son, right? So we would say, well, I know what's going on in my bank account, right? And that's fair. That's true. Maybe a lot of us, we do know. We are particular. We're checking our bank accounts every day. But for some people, they don't even have access to that because that's not what they were in charge of. And then Charlotte can also continue to explain as well why people don't report.
So we also see challenges around gender identity. So many of the older adults that we work with who are of the LGBTQ plus IA population are not necessarily people who have come out or who have identified openly and honestly their sexuality or their sexual preference. And there's a real stigma attached to that many older adults still believe. And there's also the fear of being outed. So if you tell, go ahead and tell. I'll tell everybody that, David is not your friend, that he's actually your partner. And then we'll see what happens with the family. We'll see what the family thinks of you. You're going to lose everybody. No one is going to think of you as their family member anymore. And so we see that not only in homes and in the community, but we also see it in nursing homes. So if I am of that population, maybe I'm afraid to have my partner come in and hold my hand to comfort me because what are the staff going to think? What's my roommate going to think? So gender identity and gender challenges are very much present, but not talked about. There's also trauma that people experience. So perhaps, I've had an occurrence of trauma and it was a one-time occurrence, but every time, let's say, for example, I leave the grocery store and someone steals my pocketbook. Okay, that's traumatic. What's going to happen is every time I go to the grocery store, that's going to come back up again. So that's acute trauma. That's a one-time experience, a one-time opportunity. What we also see is historical trauma. So even though I may not have been a survivor of the Holocaust, for example, or slavery, what we know is that those kinds of trauma are generational, they're historical. So if my great great grandparent was a victim of the Holocaust, those stories, that trauma, that experience for that person gets passed on to the next generation and then the next generation. And so then when it comes to my generation, it's something I become aware of and something that I uh, really see as part of my identity. The same is true for slavery. So I don't have to have been, a slave in order to experience racism in my life. And so historical trauma tends to go from one generation to the next without every single person necessarily having to have been the victim of that trauma. The next is mistrust of government and agencies. So in our culture, we tend to see the police as helpers. We raise our children to see the police as helpers. As case managers, for example, we like to think that people see us as resource guides and we can provide help when they need it. And we can provide answers when they have questions. In some cultures, the government, in fact, is the enemy. And so the last person I'm going to call if I need help is the police because the police are corrupt or the government is corrupt. And so we see a significant amount of mistrust by different cultures of government agent and agencies. And then, as Mel alluded to earlier, there's the fear of being institutionalized. So go ahead, tell. then no one's going to be able to take care of you, and then you're going to go into a nursing home, and then we'll see how you like it, because nobody's going to come and visit you. You're not going to have a television. You're going to be all alone. You're going to be have to eat the food that they feed you. You don't have any choices. And so everyone's worst nightmare, again, with no, not wanting to slight care facilities because they do a superb job. But everybody's worst fear is being put in a nursing home, and that's a threat that really works on older adults. And then the last is isolation. So what we see is that the offenders or the abusers eventually move toward isolating the victim completely from their family. They're no longer going to the senior center. They're not going to the meal site. They're not doing their grocery shopping. When they go to the physician, the abuser is going with them. The abuser is speaking for them. And so they become so isolated that, in fact, there is no one to tell. Okay. We also know that in terms of the silent epidemic, professionals are a part of the community that we need to educate. And in fact, as a coalition, we are working very hard to educate professionals. So that includes, attorneys, that includes physicians, that includes nurses, that includes case managers, anyone who's in the helping profession, regardless of their capacity. Because what we know is that many professionals do not know or don't have awareness or the knowledge around elder abuse and what it is and what the dynamics are and the types. And that's part of the reason we're doing this training today, is to make you aware of that, whether you are viewing this as a professional or an individual who might be a victim of abuse. What we find is that lack of knowledge is very significant in our culture. And so training is something that we are spending a significant amount of time doing, because the more we know, the more we can help. We also know that it's difficult for people to recognize abuse. We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to say, oh, I'm concerned about Mel because when I was at her house the last time, such and such happened, and I think something might be going on. I don't want to be wrong about that. We don't want to accuse anybody of anything. And so we tend not to recognize abuse when we see it, and therefore we don't report it when we see it. We also don't know what the law demands. Mel will talk a little bit about the law in Rhode Island, but basically it is against the law to abuse an elder. And it's interesting when we do trainings how many people don't know that, in fact, it is against the law, just like child abuse or animal abuse or domestic violence. And the other component that we see among professionals is not recognizing perhaps their own biases or biases that we have as individual caregivers or caretakers or advocates or case managers or whatever our professional capacity happens to be. Ageism is alive and well. If I see someone with gray hair, and I've experienced this myself, I'm treated differently because I'm perceived as old. Okay. And older adults in our culture are really invisible. We don't see them, we don't treat them the way we need to treat them as older adults. Sometimes we talk down to them, we infantilize them. And, that person might be of sound mind and independent as independent can be. We also experience homophobism, where we have people who in our culture are afraid of people who are of a different sexuality, or they have a particular opinion about a particular population. And so we want to make it appear that for us, that population is invisible. And then, of course, cultural values, which Mel talked about. And oftentimes professionals don't take the time to educate themselves around cultures. And in Rhode Island, we have such diverse cultures. And, if we don't take the time to educate ourselves around cultural values, then we're not going to see or understand why something might be happening. And if something is because of a cultural value, doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay in our culture. And so we have to spend the time educating ourselves and becoming aware. And the time, to become aware of cultural values is not when the patient or the client is sitting in front of you. That should have happened long before.
And then for next, Cheryl's also going to talk about, what can we do as professionals or as friends, as loved ones? How can we help older adults protect themselves? I just want to preface this by saying everything we're going to talk about is very easy to say, but it's very hard to execute. So we understand that it sounds like we're doing this. Oh, just find someone you trust. That's going to be hard when you've been isolated. But here are some steps that we still want to talk about to help protect.
So, how can we help older adults protect themselves or other older adults protect their peers? So, typically, as case managers or healthcare workers, advocates, whatever role you might be in, what we know is that oftentimes people don't feel safe talking about abuse. They feel like if they tell, then whatever the threat was made against them will happen. And oftentimes that's the reality. Okay. We want to encourage people to seek medical treatment or to trust their physicians or whomever their caregivers are, and to speak to them about what's going on, and to try to sort of find the bravery within to talk about how that black and blue really got there and that it wasn't because you walked into the door. Okay. Um, don't give away money that you need. That might sound like, kind of like, yeah, well, yeah, that you're not telling me anything new. But what we know is that for people we love, the people in our family, we want to help them. And if we have something, we'll give it to them. We'll help them. If my nephew calls and says he needs a new battery for his car and he doesn't have the money, I'm happy to help him with that. But what we see is that then that becomes a pattern where the elder then is taken advantage of financially. And in the meantime, I need the money to support my household. So maybe because I'm giving away so much money, my utilities get shut off, or I don't have money to pay for my prescriptions or to follow the particular diet that I need to follow because of medical reasons. Um, don't sign documents until someone trusted reads it. Again, that sounds like something that's pretty obvious. But what we see is that oftentimes people are given documents, and because they're given to them by an attorney or a physician or a case manager or a professional, that they think, well, this is someone that I trust, so I'll just go ahead and sign it without reading it. It's hard sometimes to find someone, especially if you live in isolation, someone who you can trust to read it. And so we've had situations where, unbeknownst to the victim, they have signed their house over to their child. They've lost their property, they've lost their car, they've lost everything that helps them to become or remain, I should say, an independent person in the community. 401s, stocks, bonds, that kind of thing. Don't give out social security numbers. That's part of a scam, but it's also something that we don't tend to think about as older adults. As younger adults, I think, it's become common knowledge that we don't give out our social security numbers, that's mine. I don't give it to anybody unless I know the reason for it. But for older adults, many carry their social security card in their billfold or their wallet or their pocketbook or their whatever it happens to be. And so, if I go to perhaps write a check because I don't have a debit card and my social security card is in my billfold, the person whom I'm writing the check to can certainly copy down my social security card, number, and I'm not even going to know it. So we have to make sure that for things like credit cards, debit cards, social security numbers, that we keep those private and we keep those cards in a safe place. We don't just leave them laying around. We don't ask our CNA to go to the bank and make a withdrawal for us or go to the ATM machine because we don't know if that's someone that we can trust, unfortunately, but that's the reality. And we don't want anyone to keep details of our financial status from us. By all means, we want people to be aware of and have knowledge of their financial situation. So if I have someone who helps me to pay the bills, that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to look at my bank statements every month. And in fact, I should be looking at my bank statements to make sure that there's been no misuse of my funds.
And then now Cheryl's also going to talk about how can we help an older victim of abuse.
So sometimes it's a challenge for us as professionals to try to balance helping keep someone safe or protected without necessarily, frightening them or having them expect that something, bad is going to happen, because not all older adults are obviously victims of abuse. But for those that are, we have to be aware of what kinds of tools, what do we have in our bag of tricks that we can use to help older adults remain safe. And so the first, and again, in no particular order, is that if we're visiting the older person, we want to do so at a time and in a location that's safe. So if I'm visiting a client who's in an assisted living or who's in a nursing home, I want to do that in private. Okay. I don't want to do it in the middle of the bingo game. Okay. We want to be observant. We want to listen really carefully, and we want to speak with older adults again in private. And this is true if we're going to someone's home. If the abuser lives in the home, then the chances that the victim are going to speak to us, safely and disclose to us what's really going on are slim to none, because we're not able to talk to them in private. We want to understand that there are barriers, again, that result from cultural differences, gender identities that we talked about, race, and disabilities, challenges, physical challenges, cognitive challenges that people have. If we do suspect that something might be going on or something seems amiss, something doesn't seem quite right, we want to ask questions just to get a sense of whether or not that sort of inner gut feeling is right, if we're going in the right direction. So we don't want to be the police, we don't want to be the judge, the jury, we don't want to be the investigators from the Office of Healthy Aging, but we do want to gently ask questions and gather enough information so that we can determine whether or not we need to report what we suspect might be going on. And a good way to look at that is to think about, am I leaving here today concerned about something? If I'm concerned, that means something might be going on, and that's enough to make that mandatory report that Mel will talk about in a little bit. We also want to we also want to acknowledge trauma that one may have experienced in their life. It's not something that we can dismiss, or we can say, oh, you've talked about that for the last 20 years, just let it go. Trauma is not something that we can just let go. If it was, we would not have people who experience trauma long term. And clearly, if people knew how to just let go of trauma, they would. Um, the next is to identify resources in the community that can be of help to older adults. And we have lots of resources here through the coalition and through our program. So we're always happy to help with identifying resources. And we also want to collaborate with our community partners. And that's part of the reason we do these trainings, is so that we can collaborate together with the different disciplines that work with older adults. And those disciplines vary, but we don't ever want anyone to feel like they're alone with something. There's always resources. There are always people you can talk with, gather information from. And again, we're happy to be a resource for you. We want to always remind older adults that they're not alone, and that if they do disclose, you're going to believe them. Okay. Because people are told that go ahead and tell. No one's going to believe you anyway because you're old. You don't have any memory. You forget everything. And we want to reinforce for them that help is available, that the abuse can end. It's not a life sentence. We want to keep older adults informed about what's going on. So if you have a victim that you're actively taking action on, we want to make sure that they're involved in the decision making and that they have the right to make their own decisions. And we also want to remember that they people have the right to decide what their plan is. So if I'm an older adult who's a victim of abuse, I have the right to stay in my home, perhaps with the abuser. I also have the right to leave. But what we have to think about is that there's nothing in it for a victim to disclose abuse, because as soon as you disclose abuse, you tend to lose everything. So, as an older adult, if I disclose abuse, what that means typically is that I'm the one who has to leave. I'm the one who has to go to a shelter. I have to leave behind all of my belongings, all of my treasures, all of my life, my life history. I have to leave behind my pet. I have to leave behind, my favorite sweater that I like to be cozy with in the winter, whatever it is. I'm the one who has to leave. I'm the one who loses everything. And it's the offender who gets to stay. And what we really, as a culture, need to be asking is what gives offenders the right to think that they can offend, as opposed to blaming victims when they stay in the situation or when they make a choice to go back to the abusive situation. And finally, what we want to really emphasize in this training is that uh, reporting abuse, reporting suspected abuse, something looks wrong, seems wrong, you know, listen to your gut. Always better to be safe than sorry, and we want to be able to sleep at night. So if we suspect, then we need to report.
Before we kind of get into um, the state law and how to report, we also want to talk about the five components of abuse, right? So who is being abused? It's both male and female, right? And it's through state law. It is 60 and older. So we try to remember that. Both men and women, age 60 and older. So what's happening? We talked about the types of abuse. We talked about psychological, physical, neglect, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and then also to remember of the co-occurrence. Say, so Cheryl mentioned earlier as an example, her nephew needed a new car battery, right? He's like, Auntie Cheryl, I really need it right now. And she goes, oh, honey, I wish I could, but I just don't have the budget this month. Some things came up. Well, if you don't give me that money, you won't see me again. You won't see my kids again, right? So it's a little bit of both, right? It's that financial aspect of it because they need money, and you also need that money, right, to live a healthy day-to-day life. But then there's that other part of abuse, that threatening behavior. So just to keep in mind the types of abuse, and a lot of times we're going to see a co-occurrence of it. So who's committing the abuse here, right? Usually it's someone who's trusted. We have family members, the adult child, the adult grandchild, a caretaker. And we do include scammers because, as Cheryl said, scamming is huge right now. And it's their full-time job, if you think about it, right? Their full-time job is to get you to trust them in a way that you can pretty much hand over whatever they're looking for, whether it be money, the house, your own deed to your house. So looking at who is committing it and having it, remember, it's someone who's trusted, right? Where we see abuse happening in any setting. We see it in a home, in assisted living, in nursing homes. And right now, in nursing homes, we're unfortunately seeing a trend where there is abuse happening there, and we're seeing a rise in sexual abuse, not necessarily always just the people who work there, but other residents, right? We're seeing other residents commit sexual abuse to another resident. So we have to look at where it's happening, correct? And then the context, the why. Well, it's that expectation of trust. You're trusting someone to help you age gracefully, right? So maybe you need a little help managing finances, right? So, but when you think about it, the context of why it's happening, age, we talk about, ageism. Say, you're trying to maybe get through something and I am Cheryl's guardian, right? And I tell, oh no, I'm Auntie Cheryl's guardian, she's getting up there in age. And, I do everything for it. It's just easier that way. And then you believe it, right? You don't ask for the paperwork. There's always paperwork to everything, let me tell you, right? But you're not asking the age. You're just assuming that my Auntie Cheryl, because she's a little bit older, she's losing it, and that's just okay to accept it.
Mhm.
We see different disabilities, right? People using that as well to commit the abuse of why they can. Legal status is also a big one too.
Mm.
Everyone's scared, depending on the legal status, if they hear, no one wants to get deported. You probably came for a reason. You want to be safe here. But if I know I can use this as a tactic, I'm going to. And like I said, going back to the expectation of trust. All right, guys. So, big question of the day: is elder abuse a crime? Yes, it is. Like child abuse is a crime, domestic violence, abuse against pets, we all know it is a crime. So, an abuse of an older adult or a vulnerable person is a crime. The Rhode Island Adult Protective Service law requires mandatory reporting of suspected abuse. That means everyone in the state of Rhode Island, if you're over the age of 18, you are a mandated reporter. There are also certain professions that are also mandated reporters, which also kind of means that there might be a fine associated if you do not report. So that's where everyone is, but we also, if you look at the state statute, it does list a certain professions, and there's that bit that could be a fine. This is not my reasoning, but an older adult is someone who is 60 years or older. And a vulnerable person, once again, not our wording, is a person 18 years or older who suffers from physical or mental incapacitation that restricts his or her ability to perform normal activities of daily life. Our series is obviously focused on elders, and we now know that elders in the state of Rhode Island is 60 or older. If you have any questions for maybe a client or someone you know who is between the age 18 and 59 age bracket, contact us. We do work with and partner with other agencies that work with that specific age as well.
And oftentimes, those victims 18 to 59 are people who are living in congregate settings. So they're living in group homes, they're living in supervised apartments, perhaps they're living at home and their one of their parents is their guardian. So, for vulnerable adults, it's not just necessarily someone who's living independently, it can be someone who's living in a group setting.
And then, and obviously, we're doing this because older adults have the right to live free from mistreatment and abuse, and that everyone has the right to report it, right? And then every citizen has a responsibility to report suspected abuse, correct? So we like to use the word suspected, not report abuse. As we've said, you are not the investigator, you're not the trial, you're not the jury, you're not anything. Your report part is just to report it of what you think might be happening. And maybe nothing is happening at best case scenario, right?
Mhm.
But you know what? Someone out there, someone from APS went out there, made the call, they did it, and they report it, and they can report back, thankfully. Um, Reports can be made anonymously. I say if Cheryl's my neighbor, I think she might be mistreating her husband a bit, right? And I want to call for her husband. When I make the call in and when the investigator goes out, they're not going to go, "Hi, Melanie Montero, your next door neighbor, thinks you're being abused by your wife. Tell me more about it." It's anonymous, okay? The only thing you can do in the reporting form is if you do give your name and number, it's just a way for a staff member to call back with any follow-up questions they may have. And a big thing to also remember about reporting a crime of elder abuse is that once it's reported and made, there's HIPAA, correct?
Mhm.
So I know I made a call 3 weeks ago, right? And I still see my neighbor is in the house with his wife. A couple different reasons, and I can't call back and say, "Hey, what's going on?" They're going to say, "Yes, we got the call and we're handling it." And then to see if someone's still staying in the environment, we want to shift our mindset a bit to not be victim blaming as well and to say, "Why didn't they leave? They should have left." We're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on why did the abuse happen in the first place. All right. And then Cheryl's going to talk about how to report.
So when we talk about mandatory reporting, we report to the Office of Healthy Aging. For those of you who may have been in the field for a while, the Office of Healthy Aging used to be the Department of Elderly Affairs. They changed their name, but in terms of state statute, it's still the same. Everyone, as Mel said, is a mandated reporter. And so Office of Healthy Aging is responsible for accepting reports of elder abuse, neglect, financial exploitation. They also do investigate cases of self-neglect, as I talked about earlier, self-neglect being something where I choose to make a decision that may not be the best decision in terms of my best interest, but I choose to make the decision anyway. Okay. So what happens is you can use the secure link that you see on the screen to report through your computer. It's a very user-friendly form and very self-explanatory. And as Mel said, you can choose to report anonymously, but for those of us that work in the field who are actually working on these cases, it's always helpful for us to have the name and number of yourself if you are the reporter, so that if we need additional information, we can gather that from you. And as Mel said, we're never going to disclose who made the report. Now, sometimes people figure it out pretty quickly, but for us, and certainly for me, I would rather have somebody figure out that I'm the one who made the report than to go home that night only to wake up the next morning and find out something really bad happened and I didn't do anything about that. Right? We all have to live with our conscience. So you can report electronically. You also see on your screen the phone number for the intake department at Office of Healthy Aging. So you can call the Office of Healthy Aging, and you can also report online 24/7, any day of the year. If you call, you're going to get a recording. You're going to leave the information that is identified in the recording, and then that will be taken care of immediately if that's warranted. So there is a live person after hours who answers the phone and will take the information and then determine what the next step is. Sometimes it's an immediate response. Sometimes it's a response that waits until the next working day. But the really what's so important to know is that, as Mel said, everyone over the age of 18 is a mandated reporter. And these are the ways that we report. Okay.
And we know we gave you a lot of information, and we never want you to feel alone with everything we just talked about. So obviously, email the coalition, contact us. We love collaborating with folks and connecting them with other opportunities, other agencies in the state. And then if you ever feel like you need to troubleshoot something or you want to talk about something, your antennas are up a little bit something, here at St. Elizabeth, we do have the Haven for Elder Justice. I am the project coordinator, but we do have an elder advocate. That is their number, 401-244-5476. Unfortunately, it is not 24/7. It is a Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4 generally. But please call with any, they do advocacy, shelter, case management, safety planning for victims, which is very important. Like I said, please give the person a call, and they'll gladly talk to you with any questions or concerns. And, we're big on collaborating. We never want you to feel like we just gave you all this and that's it, you're alone with it. We love talking to folks, and it's why we do the work that we do.
Absolutely.
Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We know you're extremely busy, so we appreciate you hopping on and watching our video. Please like our Facebook page, Rhode Island Coalition for Elder Justice, right there. As we continue to work on this series and provide more topics about elder abuse, we'll be posting them on our Facebook page. So please go on there and, keep in touch with us. We love to talk to everyone and work on our video series with us. And then if you have any questions too, please email our coalition. That'll be up there as well. And thank you for your time, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the work that you do. It's very highly valued.